Let's bring in former U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Mark Wallace. Wallace has just launched the Counter-Extremism Project, a not-for-profit group working to expose and disrupt sources of funding for extremist groups. Obviously, that is front and center in this entire situation because the reason that ISIS is such a threat is because it is well-funded, as well as so many extremist groups in Syria. You just heard Arwa's report talking about yet unconfirmed civilian casualties and how that could contribute to turning the sentiment against the coalition and the airstrikes. How big of a risk is that?
Oh, I think it's a huge risk. I think that the problem that we have here is it just shows the complexity of the landscape in Syria. It's unavoidable that we'll hit other groups. Now, one al-Qaeda group or another al-Qaeda group, these are still, it's not the enemy of my enemy is my friend here. It could be another enemy, right? So killing, this al-Qaeda-sponsored group leader is probably a victory for the United States. But we have a real risk of alienating the complexity of forces that are on the ground here. And that's one of the reasons why people have called for boots on the ground. It's very hard to do this purely from the air.
Right, as Colonel Mansour was just pointing out, the attacks on the embassies in Africa were met by tomahawks in Afghanistan 3 years later.
Right.
9/11 happened. The Syrian ambassador to the United Nations today spoke to CNN, and he talked about the Arab countries that are now joining with the United States in this coalition, in the airstrikes. And here's what he had to say.
The former Minister of Information of Bahrain said a couple months ago, she said, that was a woman, she said that ISIS as well as Jabhat al-Nusra are not terrorists and that we should encourage them. So those who are sponsoring terrorism in Syria have joined, incidentally speaking, sarcastically speaking, the so-called coalition to strike against ISIS.
He particularly, Mark, pointed out countries in the coalition, right? He named them by name. He said Saudi Arabia. He said Bahrain. He said Qatar. He said those countries are funding the terrorists.
He sounds like one of the critics in the United States about this coalition because there's been some real skepticism about the role of some of these countries in supporting the groups in Syria. Now, I think it's a very positive step that our Saudi allies are training moderate Syrian forces inside Saudi Arabia. The Qataris have obviously been really questioned extensively, and there's been real concerns raised. And I think that was a real jab at the coalition, at the United States, and these countries that are funding these disparate groups.
And the bottom line, is the funding slowing down that was coming from some of these countries?
I hope that it is. This is a historic moment. We do have a coalition. We have to get back here for a second. Yeah. We do have 5 moderate Arab states, and the Qataris perhaps, that are participating in this coalition. It has to send a signal, and hopefully this is the first day where we see a lessening of some of that funding, financial architecture, other support that's going into these groups. I hope that's the case. This certainly is a historic time right now, though.
All right. It certainly is when you think about it. The Arab states are flying flights alongside the United States. Thanks so much to you, Mark.